I grew up on a big farm in Sweden. We had a ton of different animals, ranging from dogs, cats, horses, and sheep. I was around 16 or 17, and it was in the middle of winter. I was in charge of feeding the animals before bedtime, since my foster parents had to get up early for work. I wasn't afraid of the dark, but I didn't enjoy it either. I always took the dogs with me and asked the oldest to be close to me for safety. She was a very protective dog. I was walking down from the house, and right in front of me was 2 big pastures. At the time, they were empty, or at least they should have been, since they are only used in the summer. But in the second pasture, in the middle, I saw a shadow just standing. It looked like a human, but way too tall. It was as tall as the wind shed, so around 10 feet tall. I just stood there and stared, not really knowing what I should do. Then Doris, the dog, started to bark and ran down to the pasture. You have to go around a stable and a barn to get to that pasture, and since it was dark outside, she quickly disappeared in the darkness. I started to run after her and shouted her name to come back. I remember glancing at the thing right before the stable blocked my view. When I rounded the barn, I saw Doris staring at the spot where it should be standing, but it was nowhere to be found. Not even tracks in the snow. I have no idea what I saw that night, but even now, as an adult, I refuse to go out alone when it's dark. And I'm sure that I didn't imagine it because of Doris. She never barked and ran towards anything unless she had a reason.
He had a habit of consistently moving his eyes, just like someone who is so insecure. When I asked him why he does that, he replied, "The demons keep putting their faces against me to make eye contact with me, so I need to keep avoiding their eyes." However, there was nothing in front of him. He continued to move his eyes while eating, when he was walking down the street, when he was talking with somebody. He kept looking away as if someone was in front of him. I thought to myself that he was clearly suffering from a mental illness and recommended that he go to a psychiatrist, but he stubbornly refused to, saying that there are 10 demons hovering in front of him. Eventually, our family all agreed to send him to a psychiatric hospital. He ran riot and struggled to get out, but the doctor administered a tranquilizer to him and he fell fast asleep. However, this was when the incident happened. A few hours later, he opened his eyes and suddenly screamed as he grabbed his eyes.
"Ah! Our eyes met!"
He rolled around in pain. Then he suddenly jumped up and groped his own body and face, shouting in a loud, monstrous voice, "I finally got in!" He was smiling, turning up only the whites of his eyes. I was so shocked and was perplexed at what had happened, and so were the doctors and nurses. He continued talking in a monstrous voice. "This body is mine now. This body is now Satan's. This body is now the house of demons," I shouted in anger.
"Go to hell, you evil!"
He laughed, saying,
"Peter, what's the trouble? Hell is a nice place."
After all, we called the priest and he performed exorcisms. The priest said Luke was born with eyes that could see demons, and he said that he must have seen demons all his life. How hard it must have been. Tears ran down my face. The priest performed an exorcism with his eyes covered up with a ribbon tied around his head. Luke yelled at the priest as he was tied to the bed.
"Look into my eyes. If I enter your holy body and commit a sin, how will God respond?"
When the priest sprinkled holy water on him, he let out a monstrous scream, and smoke came out with a burning sound. After a long exorcism, Luke finally fainted with his head dropped, and the priest said that no more demons would come near him. Luke woke up, and surprisingly, he no longer looked away. He regained his composure. However, even after that, every once in a while, as he walked down the street, he would point somewhere and say there is an evil spirit. But he never looked at that direction. When I looked where he pointed, nothing was there. I asked him, "Is there really such a thing as a demon in this world?" And then he said, "Yes, there are many. Every day they hover around in front of people's eyes and whisper in their ears. There's also one in front of you right now. It's struggling to get your attention. Peter, I'll tell you one thing. If you see something strange in front of you, never look at it. You just have to pretend you didn't see it. Promise me."
On an expedition to the building were recently reported missing. Moreover, I heard from my senior colleague that there had been several more people missing in the building before, but even then, he said no evidence was found. After all, I visited the building to investigate the case. It was an abandoned building that was gloomy, even at a glance. There was a small temple next to it, and I met a monk there. Then I asked the monk about the abandoned building. The monk said that the building was occupied by the devil, and told me not to even go near it. I snorted at him because I didn't believe such things, but the monk had a very solemn face, and he said, "Never go inside the building. But if you must go there, remember one thing. If you hear something, you must leave immediately. When the devil opens its mouth, the gates of hell will open as well." I half-heartedly replied okay, and went into the building with enthusiasm. I slowly looked around the inside of the dark building with a flashlight when I suddenly saw two eyes shining brightly in the dark. When I shined the flashlight, I spotted a man crawling like a snake on the floor. Then he looked at me curiously and whispered something. However, I couldn't hear what he was saying. I pointed my gun at him and shouted, asking who he is. But he kept muttering and ran away, and I followed him. Then, suddenly, my vision was surrounded with total darkness, and I heard his voice, which sounded loud. "My master says he is happy that new food has arrived." As soon as I heard that, I got goosebumps all over my body, and at that moment, I heard the monk's voice in my head. "Get out of that building right now! You are now walking through the entrance to hell, following that snake!" However, it was so dark that I couldn't see ahead. At that time, I heard the monk's sutra in my head, and it became bright again. I felt that I was not inside the building, but in a space surrounded by red veins, and heat radiated from all over the place, making me feel like I was in a pit of fire. And there was a big hole in the floor, and the inside of the hole was like the intestine of a big monster. The intestine kept on wiggling, and a number of hands came out of it that started to grab me and pull me. I fought to death, but the strength of the hands pulling me was so strong that I gradually slipped toward the hole. My body continued to be sucked into the hole as if I was riding a slide, and I called the monk at the top of my lungs as I tried my best not to be sucked in. At that moment, I heard the front door slam open, and I heard the monk's voice. The sound of the monk reciting Buddhist sutras resonated very loudly in the building. Then I heard a scream, and all the hands that had been holding me disappeared. Soon after, the scent of lotus petals began to fill the building, and as the heat dissipated, the large hole in the floor began to shrink. I got out of the hole, and the veins in the hole that had surrounded me finally faded away. At the same time, my whole body felt weak, and I eventually passed out on the spot. When I opened my eyes, I found myself lying in a temple, and the monk was reciting Buddhist scriptures next to me. He told me that it was a close call, and told me not to ever do that again. I thanked him for saving my life, and said goodbye. Since then, I never went near the building again, and only then did I realize where the missing people had gone.
Listen, I've dated a devil. I've also realized that it takes only 1 second for a person I thought was an angel to turn into a devil. My ex-boyfriend, Nick, was very sweet. When he drove me home after dating one day, I realized I had left my wallet in his car, so I went back and heard him talking to himself in his car.
Damn it, Nick, be patient. The more you wait, the more thrilling it will be.
He was talking to himself with a knife and a duct tape in his hand. I was surprised to see a new side of him, but I pretended that I didn't hear him and called his name because I thought I would be in big trouble if he picks up on it. Then, in an instant, he hid his knife and looked at me with a friendly facial expression. I was so appalled, and I wanted to break up with him, but first I thought I should gradually disentangle myself from him. A few days later, he called and asked me out on a date, but when I said no, he yelled at me.
You don't want to date me? Then I'll force you to date me.
And from that day on, the nightmare began. One day, he was hiding in front of my house, and when I bumped into him, he came running with a knife, shouting,
Do you want to become prettier? I'll perform plastic surgery on your face.
He swung the knife at me in the face, and I fell down as I tried to avoid it and crawled to the front door. Then he put the knife over my waist and shouted,
Would you like to get liposuction too?
I screamed and ran into the house. Then he pointed at me outside the window and shouted,
Manager, how much is this pig?
He looked at me and kept laughing. When I shouted that I'm going to call the police, he quickly ran away. And after a while, I got a text message from him. The text read, Doesn't it hurt? And a video was attached. When I played it, I found that it was a video of him stabbing a pillow with my picture on it with his knife, recklessly. I shuddered in shock. The next morning, when I looked at my phone, I saw that I've received 100 text messages from him. The text messages read, There's no way you can avoid me except dying. The moment you wake up would rather be in the beginning of a nightmare. If you want to live, come back to me, then I'll wake you up from your nightmare. I vomited and called the police. He seemed to have settled down after being warned by the police, but this wasn't the end. After a while, he sent me a text message saying he was sorry, and he came to my house again. As soon as he saw me, he knelt down, begged, and wept. I felt sorry for him, and when I told him that I'll accept his apology if he goes back home, he shouted, suddenly running towards me.
If this doesn't work, we have no choice but to meet in our next life.
Then he strangled me. I screamed in pain, and he continued.
Please remember me, even when you're reborn, Amanda.
I screamed for help, and he covered my mouth with his hand. Help me!
Shh, my love.
I bit his hand with all my might, and he screamed and removed his hand. Blood flowed from his hands.
Ah! How dare you bite me? Oh, yes. If you want to become a dog, I'll treat you like a dog.
He unfastened his belt and whipped me as if it were a whip. I ran out to the front door and dashed off. He followed me closely, but when he saw the neighbors who came outside after hearing me scream, he ran away. I blocked his number and texted him that I will call the police if he shows up one more time. I haven't heard from him since then, and I don't know what happened to him. I don't even want to think about it again. Perhaps, at this moment, another woman may become his victim.
For our holidays, I can say confidently that this event is one that I will never, ever forget. Just for context, my family consists plainly of just me, my mom, and my dad. I was around 10 years old, and being such a young girl, I got bored easily. My parents wanted to check out the bar. Obviously, they couldn't bring me, so they left me in the kids area. It was a place where parents could leave their kids under the supervision of the cruise staff. I met many other kids there, and soon I became friends with two girls. Let's call them Emily and Rosa, who were both roughly the same age as me. As we were all chatting, Rosa suggested that we play hide and seek. She told Emily to count and then grabbed me, saying she knew a perfect place to hide where Emily would definitely not find us. So as Emily started counting, Rosa took my arm and showed me the hiding place. Opening a door, Rosa pointed down a flight of stairs. "We go down there," Rosa said. At first, I was a little reluctant as the cruise staff had told everyone before boarding that only staff were allowed to enter this area. But Rosa kept on begging and begging, so finally I agreed. As we made our way down the stairs, we started looking for rooms to hide in, and that's when I saw it. It was at the end of the corridor. A large wooden door. As Rosa and I got closer, we could see the dust that covered the door. We could smell something rotten coming from the wisps of aged wood. Looking back at it now, these were obvious red flags, but Rosa and I were young and naive, so we entered anyway. It didn't take much strength to open the door, as it already looked fragile enough that a strong gust could break it down instantly. We entered, and it was pitch black. Rosa had a mini flashlight in her pocket, and that's what we used to illuminate the room. We could hear the faint sound of Emily's voice searching for us, and we couldn't help but giggle. We knew it would be ages till Emily found us, and that was somehow hilarious to us. But that's when things started going south. Rosa had gotten up and decided to explore this old room. She took the flashlight with her, so I was left in the dark. She told me to stay next to the door to see if Emily was coming. Rosa went off wandering into the pitch black silence, and that's how it was for a few seconds. Just pitch black silence. Until Rosa's screams and rapid footsteps filled up the room. I remember her running to me, grabbing my hand, and us bolting through the door and up the stairs back to the kids' area. Rosa's face was white. All the color drained, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. I asked her what happened, and that's when she told me. The real reason Rosa wanted to hide in this area was not because she actually wanted to play hide and seek, but because during the night in her bed, she would hear these awful clicking noises that kept her awake for most of the night. Seeing as her room was directly above this one, she suspected that the noise was coming from this room. While she was exploring the dark room, Rosa heard the clicking noise she had heard every single night and went towards it. That's when she saw the source of the noise. It was a woman, thin, with black hair tied in a disheveled bun. She had massive eyes and an awful, awful smile, which showed her mouth with no teeth. Wearing ripped clothes, and the areas that weren't ripped were covered in what looked like blood. The woman had seen Rosa and began chasing Rosa, but on her hands and knees like a dog. And that's when Rosa grabbed me and we escaped. From then on, the cruise for me was ruined. Rosa stopped coming to the kids' area, and I started having nightmares of the woman as I went to sleep. Luckily, the cruise was over soon. I was so glad to be away from that horror